Hi, I'm Adam Porter and this is my board gaming vlog, and we're looking at my top 100 board games, card games, tabletop games, dice games, all that sort of stuff. And we're now down to number 20, so we're looking at number 20 through to number 11. And at number 20 on the list is the game Yogi. Yogi started its life as a game called In a Bind from a friend of mine called Bez, Beirut Shariari. And Bez created this game. I remember playtesting it at the UK Games Expo many years ago before it was a finished game. And it's just one of those ideas where you just think, I wish I could have thought of that. It's so obvious, you know. In Yogi, what you do, or in a bind, what you do is you take a card and it tells you what to do with it. So it'll say this card must be touching your ear, or this card must be touching your elbow, or you must have your right hand above your left hand, or whatever it is, you know. So you get yourself into these weird positions with these cards sticking out all over the place, and you must continue to obey those rules. If at any point you fail to obey one of these rules, you drop a card or you move into a position that doesn't obey all your rules, then you're out of the game. And that's essentially it. You play until, you know, there's just one person standing at the end of the game, who's I say standing, this is a game you play sat around a table. Everything happens above the tabletop. So essentially it's like Twister the card game. Such a simple rule set, so intuitive, so clever, so funny. It's done extremely well. I'm so pleased for Bez how well this game has gone. It's had a follow-up, Yogi Guru, I think it's called. I haven't tried that one yet, but it's just something I admire. I admire games like this, games that manage to just such an obvious idea, but yet such a fun one, and something that no one's yet thought of, and clearly creates so much fun for so many people. So not all games have to be heavy Euros, do they? Heavy strategy games. Sometimes it's fun to just sit around and have a good laugh, and Yogi will give you that in spades. It's also a really nice production from Gigamic. Plastic cards aren't going to get damaged very easily, a nice little container. Yeah, good stuff all round. Number 19 is a classic card game from Reiner Knizia. This is High Society, which is an auction game. So a card is laid up and it's auctioned off to everybody. So everybody has to try and purchase, or maybe they don't want to purchase, so we'll have an auction to avoid purchasing a card. And they're either going to give you points or take away points depending on what the card is. But the key thing here is that the cards that you're using as currency in order to buy this are in certain denominations, and you can't break them down and make change or anything like that. So you might only have some sort of high value cards left in your hand, and you might want to bid on this card, but you don't want to bid quite that much. So I've only got a 20, but I can't break this 20 down into fives, you know, but I only want to bid, you know, 7 or 8. Do I bid my 20 and lose my 20, or do I forgo the card and hold on to it? That's the key decision in the game. It's got a really nice twist at the end where the player, you know, even if they've got the most points, if you've got the least money, you can't win. So you've got to have a decent amount of money left over at the end, so you can't go way ahead and spend far more than everybody else. It's just a selection of really clever, simple mechanisms that creates a whole load of tension, and the production of the most recent version from Osprey Games is absolutely gorgeous. Osprey Games, I don't understand how they managed to make these games so affordable. Their games are always cheap, but with the most lavish production, most care and attention and love put into them. So High Society, extremely highly recommended. This is an absolute classic card game. Now we're at the top rung here, aren't we, in our top 20 games, my top 20 games that I've ever played. And we're now at number 18, and I can't separate this from High Society. High Society and For Sale, for me, sit very closely together. Totally different designers. I think For Sale is by Stefan Dora, but a similar sort of feel, an auction game. This is a game in two halves. So the first half of the game, we've got a bunch of properties that are laid out on the table with different values on them, and we're spending money in an auction in order to take these properties. We collect up our properties, and then in the second half of the game, we're going to sell these properties. So essentially, we're using the value of the property in a different type of auction in order to gain these checks that are worth money. And at the end of the game, we want to have the most money. So we're using money to buy properties, and then we're using selling those properties for more money, and then seeing who's got the most at the very end. So two sort of different halves. You almost don't need to know the rules for the second half when you're playing the first half, but the two things do really impact. The first half really does impact on that second half. Both halves are equally fun and equally simple. It's a game that works really well with 3 players, 4 players, 5 players, or 6 players in a relatively small package. Like High Society, I would say this is an absolute classic card game. Number 17 is the game Barenpark, which is another game by Phil Walker Harding. We've had a couple of those on the list already. This is a polyomino game, a Tetris style game. I remember at the time when Barenpark came out, there weren't that many of these around, and Patchwork was the real poster child for this style of game. But Patchwork was only for 2 players, where Barenpark you can play with up to 4. It's a really satisfying game. It's simpler than Patchwork. Essentially, you just place a tile, and sometimes you'll cover a particular icon, which will get you another tile, and then you place that tile, and so on, and you're trying to fill up your boards. But each tile that you place will have points on it, and you obviously want to get to the high scoring points before the other players. So it's a bit of a race to get to those points. There are also, if you play the advanced rules, which I would always recommend that you do, there are certain objectives that you might want to achieve, different sets that you want to achieve. The expansion is fantastic, Bad News Bears. This one really raised the game for me. Barenpark was a game I could kind of take or leave. It was so simple, I could kind of ignore it, although I enjoyed it. But once we brought in this expansion with monorails and these big sort of grisly areas that are really hard to place, and it just made it a much more complex game to get your head around. Not complex in terms of rules, still very simple, but the decisions that you had to make became so much more difficult, and suddenly I found this game a real challenge, and I enjoyed that. It became much more crunchy and became actually one of my favourite games. So Barenpark, beautiful artwork, really cute from Lookout Games. It's been a bit of a slow burner, I think, but I think now it's starting to be recognised as the classic that it is. Number 16 is Dobble. Dobble is like Yogi. I see these in similar sort of regard. Okay, Dobble is just a clever idea, one idea, and so beautifully done. But you're looking at the cards. Any 2 cards will always have one thing that matches on the 2 cards. I don't even know mathematically how that's possible, but it is. And when you play Dobble with someone for the first time, inevitably you'll sit there and you won't be able to see which 2 things are matching. And somebody will go, well, this one it's obviously a flaw in the game. They've messed it up. There isn't something that matches on here. And I always have to say to them, no, there definitely will be. Just keep looking at it, and eventually you'll see it. And there always is. Of course there is. Loads of different versions of Dobble are available. I have the Harry Potter Dobble, and I think I've got a Hollywood Dobble, but there's loads of different versions that you can get. Straight up Dobble is fun. You can buy this in supermarkets everywhere, in the UK at least. I think it's the best-selling card game of the last few years, so it's really gone mainstream. This was originally a blue-orange game, but they sold it to Asmodee a few years ago. I remember when I pitched Big Bazaar to Blue Orange, at the time they still had Dobble, and they were really telling me, oh, Dobble, Dobble's been this massive seller, it sold millions of copies and all this sort of thing, how amazingly they'd done. And Big Bazaar is a speed game in a similar sort of vein. You're looking for patterns and trying to match things up and so on, and doing so at speed. Great game, Dobble, just a brilliant idea, brilliantly executed, really simple, great for children, absolutely great for children and families. Number 15 on my list is Quacks of Quedlinburg, which has been an enormous hit the last couple of years. This is by Wolfgang Warsch from Smitspieler. In the US, it's from North Star Games. And that collaboration of those different companies, I mentioned this previously with the games Taverns in Tiefenthal, that artist, Dennis Lohausen, it's just a great coming together to create this beautiful product. Quacks of Quedlinburg is a push your luck game where it's a bag building game, similar to a deck building game, where you're buying different ingredients for a potion. They all go into your bag, and then when it's your turn, you're pulling them out, and you've got to decide, when am I going to stop? Because if you pull too many white ingredients out, then your pot is going to explode and you're not going to get as good rewards. You'll still get something. That's quite nice in this game. You still get something, but you're not going to do as well as the other players. So pulling stuff out the bag, when do I stop? Am I going to go bust? That's the key thing in the game. And then the rewards that you get allow you to buy better ingredients to go into that bag, and so then you're going to be pulling stuff out again, but now you're getting better. So each round in the game you're going to do better and better, and I love that feeling of building an engine and improving throughout the game. The other nice thing in this game is that you change up the rules every time you play. You know, the ingredients, you've got the same tokens, but they mean different things depending on the cards that you've got laid out on the table. So every game you're working with a slightly different set, and particularly once you bring in the expansion, the Herb Witches, and I believe there's another expansion that's come out recently in Germany and will be out in English soon. It's just a brilliant game. I've played this a lot with my wife. It's one of her favourites, and so that's where it really connects with me. But it's connecting with a lot of people, isn't it? This is a mega hit. Number 14. When I'm looking at my list and seeing what these numbers are now, I'm getting excited because every one of these I want to go, yes, this is one of my favourite games. And of course it is, because it's number 14. This is Cockroach Poker. Where's Cockroach Poker? Here. I've also got Cockroach Poker Royal up there. This is a game where you just get to lie. That's all it is, lying. So I pass a card to you and I say it's a spider. And you have to decide whether you think it is a spider or whether you think it's not a spider. And so you might say, I don't think it is a spider. You turn it over. If you were wrong and it was a spider, then you're going to take that card and put it down in front of you. That's bad. You don't want these cards in front of you. If you say it's not a spider, we flip it over and it wasn't a spider, it was a grasshopper, then it sits in front of me. I don't want a grasshopper in front of me. Okay, so lying is risky, but telling the truth, that's risky too, because if they call you out and say, yes, I think you're telling the truth, then you might have to take it. So either way, you're taking a risk, whether you lie or whether you tell the truth. Or the player can say, I don't want to make a decision on that, and instead pass it on, and it continues around the table with the other players having to make a decision. Such a simple rule set, and so much fun just looking somebody in the eye and telling them a lie. It's fun playing this with people who are really close to each other, because they feel like they should be able to know whether somebody is lying or not. So playing it with your wife, or one of my favourite games of this was playing it with a friend of mine and her children, and specifically her daughter was playing it. And right at the start of the game, every time her daughter lied, she would giggle, and it was so obvious that she was lying to her mum, and she was losing every time playing like this. But by a few turns in, suddenly she was able to keep a straight face when she was lying to her mum, and she got really good at it. And you just the realization that I've basically introduced this child to a game which teaches them to lie to their parents with a straight face, and then walking away and leaving her mum to deal with this new ability for her child. It's just so comical, the whole thing. I love this ugly bugs sort of art style. You can see I've got a bunch of these around here: Kakerlaken Salad, Kakerlaken Dance, and Bis 20, and so on. Really good sort of range of games, but Cockroach Poker is the pinnacle of those games, by a brilliant designer, Jacques Seimet. I'm so impressed by everything that he produces. So there we go, Cockroach Poker, one of my favourite games, number 14. Number 13 on the list is Dixit, which is one of the most creative games on the list. I mean, we've previously talked about Serrano. That's probably the most creative, the one where you have to write a bunch of poetry as a party game. But here's another party game. Here we're looking at a bunch of beautiful images, and you have to give this image, or one of the images from your hand, you have to give it a title. And then everybody else has to use that title and select a card from their own hand, which they could give that title to as well. The cards are all shuffled up and laid out, and then everybody has to use voting tokens to decide which one they think was my card, the one that originally had that title. And you don't want everyone to get it right. You want some of the group to get it right and some to get it wrong. And that's the genius of the game, because you can't be too obvious. If you've got a card and it's got a whopping great elephant on it, you can't give it the title Big Elephant, because everybody's going to know the answer and you're going to get no points. You need some people to get it right and some people not to. So you're going to have to give it some sort of obscure clue that you think might work for some members of the group and not for others. That's where the creativity comes in. I mean, the most wonderful thing about the game is the amazing artwork, and there's been numerous different expansion sets for it, which just have more and more cards with this lovely surreal artwork on from all sorts of different artists. It's just one of the most beautiful games that I own. But the gameplay is really good as well. It's a great party game, works well for kids and families, works well for groups of adults, works well for people who don't play many board games. Yeah, just a great party game, Dixit. Number 12 on my list is Dominant Species. Now this is the heaviest game on my list. It's probably the heaviest strategy game that I own. This is really quite complex. It's a long game. It can take probably 3 hours or so to play. It's a worker placement game with a lot of area majority in it. So it's got a nature theme. You're sort of populating the planet with different species. You control one particular type of animal, whether that's birds or mammals or reptiles or amphibious creatures or whatever, and you're trying to get onto those various the appropriate type of terrain that works for you with the appropriate sort of food source, and the other players can manipulate that. There's an ice age that comes in and starts to kill things off, but you want to be the best adapted to survive in these different territories, these different terrain types. It's a cutthroat game, as you'd expect in a game all about nature and survival of the fittest. It's got a lot of depth. It's quite unforgiving. If you're good at it, then you're going to race ahead and the other players are going to fall way behind. Thankfully, it's not that difficult to learn. Okay, the rule set's pretty logical. You follow logical sort of processes, particularly if you're familiar with other worker placement games. But games based around nature and ecosystems and the interactions in nature, they really intrigue me. There aren't that many of them around, but this is one of the best. This is a really good sort of simulation of the way nature works, and creatures sort of dominate in certain types of terrain and environments. So complex game, heavy game, but if you're looking for something a little bit more challenging than most of the things on this list, then Dominant Species is the one to go for. And number 11 on the list is Hab Gut. Hab Gut is my favourite stock market game. That's all it is. You're buying up shares and then you're selling them off, and you're trying to sell them off for a profit. The great thing in Hab Gut is that you have information about the market. You've got some cards to the left of you and the cards to the right of you. And these cards will say that certain stocks are going to go up and certain stocks are going to go down. And on your turn, you select one card from the right and one card from the left. And one of them you're going to play at full power. So if it says +4, you play it at +4. Another card you're going to play at half power. So if it says -2, you might play it as -1. And so these stocks are going to fluctuate as the game goes on. And you're going to be buying more stocks and selling stocks off when you think they've hit a particular peak. But the nice thing is you've got a good amount of information about what's going to happen, but I can't see what's going on at the other side of the table. So the player to the left of me, yeah, they've got some of the shared information with me, because one of the selections of cards is between us, but they've also got another selection of cards between them and another player which I can't see. There's a great mechanism in it where you have to give money to charity. But you don't declare how much you're giving to charity, and at the very end of the game, if you've given the least money to charity, you're eliminated from the game. It doesn't matter whether you've won or not, you're eliminated from the game. You don't count for scoring, and then ultimately the player with the most money at the end of the game wins. And that's those two really nice mechanisms, the shared information and that thing of I've got to give some to charity, but I don't want to give too much or I won't have any money left at the end, but if I don't give enough, then I might be eliminated. It just mixes together into a simple but really exciting, really tense game. This one's been out of print for a long time. It only ever got a German release, which is a shame. It's by Carlo Rossi, who also made Leglos, which is a game that I've talked about previously. Totally different style of game, a party game. I believe Hab Gut might be coming back in 2021 from Errors Games. I think they've got the rights to it. They released a game a couple of years ago called Divinity Derby by the same designer, which was a race game that used very similar mechanisms. It was all right. It was okay, but it didn't hit the same heights as Hab Gut for me. Harban Gut looks much more boring than it is. It would be nice to see it with a much more modern sort of approach to the art style and things like that. There was a game a few years ago called Stockpile that looked so much more inviting, and I think Harban Gut is a better game than Stockpile, but it could do with a graphics sort of overhaul to show how exciting it really is. Yeah, one of the best games around, Harban Gut. I've never regretted sort of searching out a German copy of this. Completely language independent, so you can play this with a printout of English rules off the internet, and you don't need to adjust the components or cards in any way. So let's see what that's done to the list. So what we had before, between 21 and 100, Zock Verlag were out ahead of the publishers, with Rio Grande and Hans im Glück close behind, and then a bit of a gap for Matago, Schmidt-Spieler, Games Workshop and Lookout. So can Zock Verlag hang on to that lead? Let's have a look. Yes, they're still out ahead with 6. Still Rio Grande with 5 and Hans im Glück with 5, then Schmidt-Spieler and Lookout on 4. So that gap is closing a little bit as we get down towards the finish. Looking at designers, we previously had Rainer Knizia and Wolfgang Kramer ahead on 4, but again, still a close run thing. And now Rainer Knizia is out ahead on 5, on his own out on 5, with Wolfgang Kramer and Phil Walker-Harding on 4, Andreas Siefarth, Michael Kiesling on 3 apiece. So it still could go either way when we move on to that final 10 in the next video. Looking at themes, fantasy, there were 10 games with fantasy in the first 80 games that we looked at, then Ancient World and Anthropomorphic Animals following up. So moving on to today, 10 games of fantasy still, Ancient World on 7, Anthropomorphic Animals on 7, and for the first time, if we add together the Anthropomorphic Animals and regular animals, we're now beating the fantasy, so we would have 13, although I'm keeping them apart because I consider them separate things, games about animals doing human-like things and games about animals just being animals. Moving on to game style then. So previously tile laying was way out ahead with 11, what seems to be an unsurmountable lead, 7 for time pressure and area majority. So is that still the case? Is tile laying still out ahead? Yes, it is. Now it's 13 games with tile laying in those first 90 games we've looked at, and then time pressure, area majority, and party games are following, with network building, stock holding, and engine building behind. So that takes us to number 11, which means we've only got the top 10 to go. So we'll be covering that in our next video tomorrow. So thanks very much for watching. I'll see you then.